Presented by Communications by Design and the CBD team of instructional coaches, this is Transforming Learning.
It's nothing short of an exercise in humanity. The systems from which these students come are vastly different, but the students, it's the same.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Zach.
And I'm Amy.
And for this episode, we have David Theune. He is a guest previously, and if you didn't hear it, it's on episode 22. And he is back with us again to share after having an incredible experience, international experience. David Theune traveled to the Netherlands to do a kind of teaching project under the Fulbright Scholarship, and I sat down with him and had a chance to talk about that experience and the ongoing influence it has and will have on his work. Amy, what did you find interesting about this?
One of the things that I thought was really interesting in this conversation is David shares about the differences in educational systems in the US and the Netherlands. And I think that will be really interesting for our listeners to hear how very differently these two countries approach education.
And while he was there in the Netherlands interacting with these educators, also interacting with students to continue the work on his project, which involves a podcast and sharing students' stories.
Yeah, and what this really made me think about was how, as an educator, how I give my students voice and opportunity to share their own stories in my classroom.
Absolutely. Well, let's take you right to David Theune. So David Theune, welcome back to the show. Thanks for joining us again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be back and, complete the story maybe.
Yeah, complete the story. And that's exactly it. So it was episode 22 in the podcast previously when you shared with us this incredible experience, the Fulbright experience. And you talked with Pete a little bit about how that happened, how it came about. And then at the end of the episode, we said, so we got to get you back on to hear how it went. And so here we are to hear how it went.
It was spectacular. In a word, spectacular. I learned a lot, but played a lot as well. And everything. Made observations about the classroom, made observations about the world, made observations about students, made observations, of course, about myself and my family as well. So, yeah, it was great.
Absolutely. So back in January, you headed to the Netherlands and spent until it was about middle of June?
Yeah, that's right. Actually, we actually left right before January 1st. So we arrived December 29 in the Netherlands, and then we left actually early July 5. We ended with a trip, a family trip that had nothing to do with the Fulbright experience, but ultimately flew back at the beginning of July. So.
Well, it seems to me that if you're going to be in the Netherlands, in Europe for that amount of time, take advantage when you can.
Well, it was amazing because of course it will. I mean, it wasn't cheap, but it will never be cheaper to take advantage of it than having your home be the Netherlands and being able to travel from there. So yeah, we definitely took advantage of that and got to travel quite a bit. So
awesome. So in terms of the project, the experience itself, you had expressed to us before leaving that your main goal, your first goal, was to seek partnership with schools, teachers, someone in the Netherlands in terms of your Share Chair podcast and Elevate Empathy work. So on that front, how did it go?
Yeah, it went really well. So the experience was... It took me a month to get into some schools. One school was right away, and then I was like, "Oh, this is great because this is I'm gonna roll straight off from January, and I'm just gonna be packed with interviews and things like this." And in fact, I hit a bit of a cold spell just early on. Frankly, I was sending emails. Honestly, I wish it would be fun to go back and count them actually so that I knew. It felt like 100 plus emails to schools all over the Netherlands, throughout the whole country. I would just find schools online and just grab the headmaster's email and write an email. As you can expect, I mean, schools are busy places. Schools everywhere seem to be busy places. And I just didn't hear back. And when I did hear back, often it was love the idea, but we can't commit, which I can understand. I understand. I'm confident, and this is what ended up happening. Once I was able to give the pitch in person, then it was more appreciated, I guess. But that's what I needed. And wouldn't you know it? I mean, here we are, we're a month in. I'm doing all the work from the office. I'm doing all kinds of things to get ready for the moment when I could get into more schools. And what did it take? It took whatever, I don't remember, of course, what night it was, say a Thursday night or something. I'm at a neighbor's. We'd started to make friends already, and we're playing some FIFA, actually, video game on PlayStation, when his buddy says, oh, well, my girlfriend is a teacher. She would love this idea. Why doesn't she just come over? You could kind of talk to her about it. And we talked, really engaged with each other on the topic. She's like, you have to come in. And she goes, and I'll share your idea with my network. And then boom, 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 then from about mid-February, I would say, until we left in June, I was just busy traveling the country, finding stories. So that was way too long to ultimately say. Once I got rolling, what would happen is I'd get into a school. I would offer first just to be a part of an hour's Q&A, or even a 2-hour Q&A if a teacher wanted me there. The students could ask questions about American schools, or about, our schools specifically here in West Michigan. We would talk about, where Michigan was, for example, and where my school was, what it looked like. I'd give a little presentation, but mostly Q&A, because the students were just so curious. And then at the end of that, I would say, well, here's what I'd kind of give the students the pitch, right? I'm doing this to share student stories from my hometown and home area, and I'm wanting to tell your stories as well so you can find connection. Would any of you like to join me? And always 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 hands would go up. And students, not surprisingly, want to share their story. If you're willing to listen, they're willing to share it. And that was true throughout the Netherlands as well.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense just in your experience with that work, over these several years now. So then tell us, as you started to capture the attention of the schools and then, of course, the students and such, what were you able to come away with? How did it end up with that work specifically?
Yeah, sure. So what ended up happening is my goal, there are several things, of course, that ended up happening. The first goal was to capture about 15 stories. I just didn't know how this would go. I thought, if I could capture one story at 15 different schools, I'd feel pretty good about that and feel satisfied. By the time I left in July, I had 45 stories. When I got into these schools, lots of students were ready to share. I said, I'll come back tomorrow and I'll capture your story if I didn't have time for them today. But I will hear your story. So still ultimately got into about 15 schools, but walked away with 45 different recorded stories, which have been and are continuing to be published on the podcast, on the Share Chair podcast.
So even now, someone could go to the Share Chair podcast and see, is it indicated? Is there any way to know where these stories came from, which ones were from where?
Yeah, so right in the title, if it comes from the Netherlands, it says at the end of the title, Netherlands. Otherwise, it's, you can expect it from West Michigan or somewhere. If it's from a different, because we do have occasional stories coming in from other places. This is the ultimate goal, is that we will get stories from other places. Then I list those. If they're from West Michigan or Spring Lake specifically, then it's not labeled as such, but the Dutch ones are.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So capturing the students' stories, how about then the interaction with and engagement with the teachers in the schools? So
my own experience with that was that it was quite good and effective to be in teachers' lounges and talking to them about the project and what I was doing there. But it was also hard, as it's hard here, I have to say, to get a long-term commitment. So I'm not disappointed by it. I was able to do some other good work, and we can talk about that as well soon. I think that it's ongoing. So to ultimately say, hi, will you help me? I mean, so I ended up with about 2 or 3 really strong teacher friends where I kept going back to them and saying, hey, can I keep coming in? I know students are talking. They kept talking about the experience. We just developed this good friendship. I do want, and they have said they'll record student stories for me. It's just hard to do. It's a passion project. It's a passion project for them. There's no pre-made class set up to capture these student stories. So everyone has to be willing to schedule and stay after school. So I don't have that set up yet, but I also am not throwing in the towel on it either because of these friendships. We need to let the friendships find their footing now that we're apart, right? And then I think it can be an ask again. Yeah. So I could see, for example, I have a friend in a city called Swala and a friend in Alkmaar. I have a feeling if I went to them and asked them now, hey, could you send me a recording or 2, they'd be able to do that. But to be able to do it regularly, as we do in Spring Lake weekly, it's a little bit much to ask for now, but it could happen still. I'm not throwing in the towel on that. So,
and understanding the amount of content and the frequency of publishing, is there kind of a vision for we want to have a story from this place or from different places this many times?
Yep, there is. So the immediate vision is that we're doing every other. I have enough Dutch episodes to go through the year if we go Spring Lake. Usually we publish on Sunday night to have it available, so about Sunday evening is when it is available. And we go Spring Lake, Netherlands for now, and we should have enough of those to carry us through this entire year, giving me this whole year to try to find more people from the U.S. to help tell stories and actually kind of lean on these friends and say, starting next year, as the next step of our connection, could you send us some stories and put that either into curriculum or into an after-school activity or something like that? So yeah, there is a vision for sure. Yeah.
And maybe then you were just hinting at the comment you made earlier that there's something more. You said there's something more.
Yeah. So that more is that with one of these teachers who. The whole idea of the podcast started from a bullying issue, and okay, we don't have to go back down that whole story. People can listen to the episode. But it started with cruelty often stems from not understanding a person. So the podcast is here to understand a person, right? Without having to see them or be with them. But one of the teachers that I really enjoyed said, what about meeting them and seeing them? And I said, terrific, let's start dreaming. And while I was in the Netherlands, we started dreaming up what an educational, cultural exchange would look like. And I just received applications for students to travel in early June to the Netherlands with me, and they'll attend school for about 4 days, and then we'll also do some touring of cities for about 4 or 5 days. I can say with near certainty this is going to happen. The money hasn't been... I can't go 100%, but I mean, it's 99%. I just yesterday extended invitations to the students to actually travel with me. We have we each have 11 students. So Spring Lake students will host the Dutch students for 10, 11 days when they come in May. And then those same students will host us for 10, 11 days in June, hopefully developing really good friendships. So this is a big deal, and I'm really excited about it.
That's really, so this is the first time I've heard about that, and I'm really excited hearing that. But, contrasting kind of a traditional swap or exchange program where you trade places and then the students are actually building relationships with each other in the exchange too.
Yes.
So that's huge.
That ultimately they'll be together for, Well, gosh, 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks in a 4-week period, in a tight period. I mean, they're spending almost a month together, and we're hoping to get these students connected with each other. Like I said, we're still doing some of the administrative work of collecting money, making sure everybody is in. But once they are, I mean, I think by early November, mid-November, we'll be able to make the matches, and they can start talking to each other on WhatsApp or on social media, whatever social media they want to use, and can already start discussing their days together and what those will look like, and start developing those friendships. So when we do the actual exchange, they maybe already know some things about each other.
Yeah. And so then the comment being, it's more, so the building the relationships, but also it's more than just this extra thing that's floating out there. You're starting to integrate the idea into a greater experience as well. That's a big part of my next question I think I would ask is, just as you think about the purpose of your goal, your intent with this is so important culturally in schools and culturally, societally outside of schools. Mm-hmm. As you think about that, what place do you see this kind of work in a greater sense within schools, within culture and society? And then I think this is an example of that move where students can actually build relationships and experience perspective in different ways.
I would say, and I hope a person doesn't think this answer is too weighty or too heavy. It's nothing short of an exercise in humanity. To understand a way another person lives. Here's the major, all of my work in the Netherlands, I could boil down to a sentence. The systems from which these students come are vastly different. We can get into this if you think it's interesting, but the Dutch educational system is vastly different than the U.S. educational system. The cultural experience, the community, the laws, I mean, just putting it out there, the laws in the Netherlands, very different than the laws here in the United States. But the students, their desires for the future, their concerns of the present, their want to be included with other people, it's the same. Systems don't matter on a human level. They do matter. Okay, sorry, I should rephrase that. Systems do matter. But individuals who come from those systems have similar desires, wants, concerns, needs. And to have my students witness those very human necessities, although they come from very different systems, it's beautiful. It's the thing. To me, there's no better education, frankly. There's nothing better.
That's rich. It is. And, David, you say that. I personally, so I haven't really traveled abroad hardly at all outside of the North America continental area. But secondarily, and I talk to anyone who's traveled at a distance and with a similar kind of intent, the humanity of it is similar. And it doesn't really matter. So you said systems, don't necessarily matter. Systems do matter. Maybe in that sense they don't matter. Because you can't take the humanity out of it. Like the system doesn't do that.
A teen is a teen, no matter the system from which he or she comes. That there is a base, a foundation to humanity that does combine us all, that connects us all. This desire to be accepted into a community, the desire for some kind of positive future, whatever that means to us, right? What it means to us is different, but just that the fact that we want it is common. Some kind of a future that excites us or that makes us happy. Those things are human, no matter the system you're in. Yeah. So says my own research and findings. Yeah.
Which I think is substantiated by what others have said too.
Yeah.
And in thinking about that, why then do you feel, David, with a parallel humanity, or a kind of, in a sense, a parallel human experience, regardless of where you are and who you are and what you're living in and under, why do you then feel still so strongly in the value of diversifying that perspective, in seeing that other life and that other person and that other human?
Because I think they might not see it without going there, right? We can look at the Netherlands. I mean, you ask my students, what do you know about the Netherlands? They're like, well, tulips and legalized marijuana,
wooden shoes,
windmills, and and maybe the older students go, isn't there something about the red light district too? I mean, it's like these are the things, right? So what we think of in our heads when we think about another culture are their cultural identities. We don't think about their human identities. I mean, and that's a mistake for me as well. I'm thinking as a whole people. By the way, that happens the other way. I mean, in every single classroom I went to, truly, I think every classroom I went to, I was asked, do you actually have, like, gun drills? And I had to say, yes, we do. It's just it's just the truth. Yes, we have drills in case of an active shooter. That is, so then we are that culturally to these students. That is part of our identity, but it's not part of an individual's identity. So we tend to think too much. Even if we're good people, we just think too much of every individual as a culture. It makes sense. The brains do that because it's just easier, right? But I want my students to dig into the individual at that individual level.
Yeah.
And that can't be, to your question, that can't be done. That can't be done just by thinking about it. You have to meet the person.
And that comes back to the point then you made earlier with the work of the Share Chair podcast. We know the power of story. And I love, by the way, just your background in education, David, and you talk about how the story was one of the things that brought you into the role of being teacher. So we know the power of story. But as you were saying earlier, it's very likely true that to simply consume someone else's story probably isn't enough to really get to the end goal of true empathy.
No doubt. I mean, there's no doubt that's true. The podcast acts as hey, we can't all get to see to each other, and so at least listen. But there's no doubt the exchange of ideas, the being in the room together, looking at each other, then having a shared experience. Go to the beach together. Having that shared experience, being able to laugh about something together. Of course, this is the ultimate in understanding and empathy, even more than the podcast, no doubt.
And so that's only going to be available to the few, right?
That's
right.
The
few who can or who will or who want. But one of the earlier questions, and I want to come back to it within that context now, is what does this work mean for just the day-to-day in school and society on the whole, but certainly as we think about just the structure of school and education, you're paving this way now to create the authentic experience with relationship. Yeah. Can we somehow get that or an element of that still into, or should we? Maybe we shouldn't. What's your thought on that?
No, I think we should. So one of the ways that another way that we're working together is with a different teacher. We actually read the same text. Frankly, it's my colleague. It's a different class than what I teach. But I connected my colleague and my friend in the Netherlands. It's off of Persepolis, which is an Iranian, it's an Iranian story done in graphic novel form. And I'm working with them, but they're working together more on how can that be, how can they do basically like book clubs, but through Google Docs, through, Skype is challenging if you're trying to do it in the classroom. And now how do you have 25 people talking at once? It's so mainly through Google Docs, through essays and revisions of those essays, though, leaving comments on each other's ideas and thoughts. So that's a very real way that we're doing it. Now, here's another thing, though. It's hard for other teachers to be able to do that without knowing somebody, right? And so I'm thankful for this experience from the Netherlands, because it's like, of course, people are teaching the same literature. It's actually quite simple. I mean, it's shockingly simple once you have the connection.
That's powerful. And that's, I've heard many express, I want to be able to do things like that. I don't know where to start. I don't know how to make the connection. And there's a lot of great tools out there that try to help provide some of those contexts. Even just social media in general can help with that. But to your point, you, even when you were in the Netherlands, had a hard time making some of those connections initially until you met the person.
Yeah, that's right.
And the person could vouch for you. And
then it goes from there. The relationship. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
So I think as we contemplate your experience on the whole, David, and now here you are, you're back in the classroom, operating in a pretty similar capacity to what you were before. Mm-hmm. However, I can't imagine that an experience like that leaves your thinking the same as it was before. So in your mind and in your work now, in the classroom day to day, what's different?
First, I'd say this is a challenge because I am different, but my thoughts are different and have expanded. But the ideas or the goals are the same. And so I'm working on it, is what I'm saying. I do have an answer to the question, but I would say that, we need to talk again in a year or 2 years. I think probably the listeners will have had enough at that point. But my point is, I'm not sure in some ways how it's going to work in yet. There's no doubt it's going to, because it's in my system now. It's in my blood, this kind of global thinking and imagining. But I haven't been able to put it all to practice just yet. Now, having said that, one way that the Netherlands is very different is that they honor the trades differently than we do. So here's what that means. This is the best way that I can describe it quickly. It's a complex system. All education systems are, I know. But they have standard school only until age 12. Everyone's following the same track, same everything, only until age 12. At age 12, between a test, frankly, from my perspective, it's a bit young. But at age 12, they take a test, and with teacher recommendation, they push basically into 3 tracks. For lack of a better word, I would say it's a practical track. This is any trade. Yes, it's plumbing, it's engineering. It's also though like aero engineer. Maybe not engineering, but mechanics, aeronautical mechanics. It was fun. I went to one school where, in fact, they were working on planes to be mechanics later on, and it's right near the giant airport of Amsterdam. It's amazing. They had this giant hangar. They had about 4 or 5 different types of aircraft in there working and doing the work, and it was just really cool. So one is practical. One I would call professional, so teachers, nurses, business people. And then the other is theoretical, researchers, at real kind of high academia, this kind of thing. So everyone is in school to age 12, but at age 12, 13, you're going into one of these tracks. There are some drawbacks to it, no doubt, okay? Is it too young? Yeah, I think it could be. But there is also a pro to it. If you're at age 13 and you're kind of feeling, I don't like school at all, and it doesn't work for me, and you're put in the practical track, you start to feel like you're where you belong. I mean, it's possible you start to feel a belonging that you wouldn't feel in our system when you go through age 18. Everybody's in yes, there are some tracks, IB, AP, whatever the case may be. But if you're not in those tracks, it can sometimes really be a struggle to be in high school in the U.S. We have tech programs, which is great. Those students, though, often come back to being in general ed classrooms and are just aching to be back at the tech center. This is where they feel comfortable. In the Netherlands, imagine from age 12, 13, you're at tech center all day doing that training. It honors that differently. That's a long way to say what I'm trying to do is respect my struggling students more. I'm trying to create pathways to them having success by judging them against their previous work, not against their peers. Because they're coming in differently. They have had vastly different experiences in school, vastly different experiences in their homes. And to think that my freshmen this year can all end up at the exact same place, well, one, it's not expecting enough of the high flyers, and it might be expecting too much of the students who are struggling. And so I'm just trying to honor students and assess them against themselves, against work that they did either earlier in the class or even bringing in old essays that they've written. Can they prove they're growing? Because if they are, then that's what we need to see. So that's how, right now, that's how I've changed. I've changed my mindset. I'm learning more and more empathy myself. My mindset is, and I've been caring about empathy for a long time, but you're never, oh, now I'm empathetic. I'm done being empathetic. I'm still learning, and I'm learning with my work-ready students.
Yeah, and that's, I think about the purpose of education. And so without the two of us sitting here and just philosophizing for the next hour on, or day or year on the purpose of education, our previous episode
I listened. Yeah, I heard.
Yeah, so we had some really compelling ideas discussed in that episode. And I think one of just the general concepts that always sticks with this kind of thing is like just flourishing. So that's Dave Stewart Jr. talks about long-term flourishing. And however else you want to phrase that, the idea of just being able to be successful because there's so many different areas and ways and things in your life that we just want you to be able to do it. And that feeds the idea then, David, that my role isn't to score you against your peers, isn't to check enough boxes to say, okay, you've got our content to such a degree that now you'll be successful in life because you checked those boxes. But this idea of here's where you've been, here's where you're headed, I want to help you get there.
Exactly. In an English classroom, I want them to be able to develop their ideas. So I have this idea, okay, how did you get there? Where did that come from? Being able to recognize it, being able to look at their own work and say that they are improving through reflections, thoughtful reflections, being able to identify pieces of their own writing that is growing. To me, that's really important. That metacognition of looking back at their work and identifying growth, that's what I want to see. And if they're not able to do that, then there is an issue and we have to address it, and we need to get better at that. To me, that's everything. They have to be able to say, I am growing, and I can show you how. Without that, then we have an issue, and we got to keep working, frankly.
Definitely. So, David, you've said in the past that one of the driving forces behind, and I'm drawing this right from that previous episode, in fact, where one of the driving forces behind what you're doing is to be able to influence in a meaningful way, and whether yourself to be meaningful for the students or to influence them so that they see or feel meaning. Mm-hmm. In a sense, kind of the Everest statement of your work and what you're trying to do in education. Yeah. Do you feel that still captures that essence well? Would you say it differently now? What are your thoughts?
My work, if it doesn't matter, it won't matter. So we have to find the thing that matters, but it is hard. I will say that it is hard. This is not easy work to make. How do you make vocabulary matter? I have to write this essay. How do I make that matter? Why does it all matter? And so understanding purpose, being clear with my students about the purpose and what is the goal of this. The goal is not, so for my freshmen, thinking about the goal, well, we want to develop this to get you into college. That kind of language will only work for a couple of students, So no, we want to be able to argue well. Okay, if it's an argumentative essay. And you will need and want argument in your life. You want to be able to argue well and argue articulately. Let's think about how those ways. Now let's argue imagining getting better at that skill. So just trying to put them in a position of where they see the work not as work, but they see it as skill, and how it will benefit them either in the future or in the here and now. I mean, that's important. The other bigger Everest statement idea is shifting a little bit to, frankly, to a more global perspective. I want to, and am curious about global education opportunities. Let me be clear, that does not mean teaching in other places. I just mean, how can I be a leader in our district to encourage global thinking to my colleagues? So I actually came back with this idea that maybe, I want to keep influencing students for sure, but I'd love to start influencing my colleagues and my peers. I don't know just yet how to do that, but it is in my head that that Everest statement is no longer only for my students. Of course, I want to be following too. We talked about this at the beginning of our talk today. I'm okay. I don't need to know. I don't need to be the one leading all the time. And I'm ready to learn that lesson better and better every day. I'm fine with that. But I would like to share more global ideas with my peers and be thinking from little old Spring Lake on a global scale.
We can certainly appreciate that, even just in this conversation, knowing that it'll go out to an audience where educators are listening to these things and thinking about their own practice and their own work. On that note, David, and to kind of wrap it all up, what would you, so I'm just thinking about you as an educator, David. You're a teacher, but you're more than just a teacher in your own classroom, and the Fulbright is an example of that, among other things that you've tried to do. You spend quite a bit of your time trying to do things to help other educators and students who aren't even necessarily your students in various capacities. What encouragement would you offer then as you think about how you can more and more try to support other educators?
Take a big step. Take a step toward global thinking. Now, honestly, that might be to a neighboring community that is just different than your own. That's a great start. Go do something together. Go find a festival and take half a dozen students. Start small. That would be great. A cultural festival in a city nearby, and just take students along with you. Start there. I remember doing some of that. It's funny, I actually hadn't thought about this, but maybe of course there has been, but I haven't done this reflection. These steps, smaller steps that have led me to these bigger global considerations, started with community. I would take students to some events in Muskegon, in Detroit. We did some things together there. Those were great experiences for us. I go every year. Then the next step, maybe go just try things. I've been to Stratford with students. Go for a weekend. Start with an evening, a day at a cultural festival. Expand to a weekend away. Start small. Then start thinking about how you can expose your students to unique cultures, different areas and places in the world, different physical landscapes. Because exposing them to that starts to widen the blinders to what life can be and could be for them as a person moving forward. Yeah, make a step. Put people in a position to see others in their own space.
Really appreciate that, definitely, and I've no doubt our audience does as well. So, David, unfortunately, that's about all the time that we have to talk to you right now, which I think is actually great because that just means we've got to do this again.
All right. Hey, I'm up for it. I like to chat it up for sure.
Absolutely. Well, and you said, ask again next year, and some of these things will be in a different place.
They will. There's no doubt. Yeah. No, I think oddly, though I came back with a few really clear ideas about what I want to do with my Fulbright experience, there are ways in which my classroom has not yet changed from the Fulbright experience, but that it will certainly, because I can't undo that experience. So, yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, definitely. Well, so we've done this before, but let's do it again. In the interim, before we have you on again, what are the best ways for people to hear from or get in touch with you?
Sure. Well, one way is just through email, even through Spring Lake School's email. That's a good way, of course. Through Twitter is at David Theune, but it's a weird last name, Theune. And through Facebook, frankly, is also good. And maybe that's about it. We do have the Share Chair podcast, and that can be found on iTunes and Spotify and SoundCloud. And also you can follow it on Facebook. So there are ways to stay in touch that way as well.
Excellent. We really appreciate your time. Thanks again.
All right. Thanks.
Well, what an experience and what a thoughtful educator.
So in this episode, David talks about using a podcast to amplify students' voices and share their story, but it really made me think about how there are lots of ways to do this. And I think as teachers, as adults, it's easy for us to fall into the trope that students are always on their phones, that they don't talk to each other, that they don't care about things. But this really makes me think about how much that's not true. Universally, in any culture or background, that's not true. Our kids really do care. But are we giving them an opportunity to share their story? And one thing that David said that stood out to me was, are we listening? Are we listening to them?
Yeah, so easy to have these general and broad opinions about our students, especially because we spend so much time around them, right? You think about the classroom teacher, you really do know your students in a sense, but how well do you actually know them internally without listening, without hearing their story? That's great. And I think he carried it a step further. So David's been doing this now for a number of years, at least with the Share Chair podcast. And after the Fulbright experience, and you heard him in the interview articulate that he's seeing a missing link here, which is not just hearing the story, but also seeing and even, if possible, living the experience, whether that's around or alongside others. And that, in his mind, is kind of the way to truly deepen empathy in that sense. And so I really appreciated as he was talking, like in his own journey and the growth, it really takes a little bit more. And he's trying to formulate how best to create or connect experiences for students and other educators that can do just that. So much on the topic, and certainly connecting with David and some of his resources will be helpful for any of our listeners. But we would love to always connect and reach out to you as well. And you can find everything we do and all the services we offer at cbdconsulting.com/elevateedu. And of course, feel free to connect, reach out anytime. And we'd love to hear your story. That might be the end of the episode, but our team of instructional coaches never stops helping educators. Visit us at cbdconsulting.com/elevateedu to learn more about how we can support you in your efforts to elevate teaching and learning.